Good evening, everybody. My name is Fred. For the next 70 minutes or so, with your help, we're going to try to paint at least an impressionistic picture of what foreign policy might be like under President Donald J. Trump. For about 40 minutes, the three of us up here will have a conversation about various aspects of this. And then we'll devote the last half hour to your questions and comments. But if you don't mind, leave us free for the first part of this to have the conversation, and then it'll be over to you. Now, we're only three people. We've got limited time, so we're not going to be able to cover everything. Karin will focus mostly on the domestic roots of President Trump's approach to foreign policy and the implications for Europe. Malia will help us understand how the U.S.-China relationship may evolve during President Trump's second term. She can also take a couple of minutes to explain to us what the hell is going on in Korea. I'll attempt to moderate the conversation and close out with a few words about the Middle East. Now, this does not mean that we consider hemispheric, African, or climate change challenges to be unimportant, okay? Please, during the question period, comment period, feel free to raise any foreign policy related subject you want. So let me begin with a quote from a recent edition of the Wall Street Journal and one from the Atlantic. First from the Journal. These are quite brief. Donald Trump will re-enter the Oval Office with the world far more dangerous than when he was first president. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the introduction of North Korean troops complicate efforts to negotiate an end to the war. In the Middle East, Israel's retaliation for the October 7th attacks by Hamas has seen tens of thousands of Palestinians killed, and most of Gaza's more than 2 million people have been displaced. Iran, which has been engaged in a cycle of escalating attacks with Israel, has moved closer to obtaining the weapons-grade fuel needed for a nuclear weapon. Quote, his whole worldview is maximum pressure. It's that simple, unquote, said a Trump advisor under consideration for a senior foreign policy position. Quote, scare your negotiating partner into thinking you will do what most think is unthinkable, unquote. In a recent interview published in The Atlantic, David Frum, a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, said the following, quote, America first harkens back to the 1940s when it was a slogan about keeping America out of the Second World War. America first as a phrase is often associated with the idea of isolationism. But Trump is not an isolationist. He is very keen on involvement with foreign countries. He has business in foreign countries. He collects all kinds of benefits from foreign countries, for himself, his family, and his businesses. What he is interested in is a more predatory approach to foreign countries, where countries pay the United States for military protection, and where trade is organized in a way in which the United States wins and other countries lose, unquote. Karin, do you think Frum has it about right? And what is your sense? What is it about our domestic politics, our situation in the United States, that helps account for the possible approach of President Trump?
It's an interesting quote you read, especially in light of yesterday's New York Times article that stated that the Trump family will take some limitations on the business and how to conduct the business, but certainly not as much as during the previous administration. Some proposals that were put forward during the campaign certainly had an isolationist nature attached to them. Stephen Miller's claim that the Harris administration would lead to World War III, for example, or the high tariffs, are inherently isolationist in nature, immigration policies. And of course, now also the pick of Tulsi Gabbard as the Director of National Intelligence, I would argue, is truly an isolationist. But I agree with Frum, by and large, that the Trump administration is not isolationist, and not just in terms of their own personal interests and their business' interests. It is, in fact, predatory. I really like the term predatory to describe what the Trump foreign policy will look like. It's a good term, as the way I see the policy is to show strengths, to secure American interests without acknowledging any possible repercussions or the inherent weaknesses that we are facing in dealing with these challenges ahead of us. What Trump is promising people is a show of American power to achieve American interests. And I have seen no reflection really on the potential repercussions. I teach at Dutchess Community College, and I'll draw on my experience there here and there whenever I can, because as a professor of government, but especially at a community college, I really have my finger on what's going on in society, I think. But stepping back, every semester I show my students Nikki Haley's introductory statement when she was first chosen to be the US ambassador to the United Nations. And she gave an extraordinary statement which captures the foreign policy that the Trump administration stands for the first time around, and I see great similarities. And I'm going to quote directly from her speech. I'm not cutting anything out. I want to leave it in the context that she gave it. Her statement stated that the way we show our value is to show our strength, show our voice, have the backs of our allies, and make sure that they have our backs as well. For those that do not have our back, we will take names. We make points to respond to that accordingly. This is a time of strength. Everything that seems obsolete, we will do away with. In other words, America First means demonstrating American power for American interests. Old alliance structures out, and alliances we build not on ideological commonalities rooted in the principles of international world order, but based on what potential allies have to offer to the United States. Now, we've all been around for a while, and so far this may remind you of early administrations, for example, the George W. Bush administration, which was very much rooted in realist thinking. And realist thinking does acknowledge that American interests are the only objectives of American foreign policies. And realists do not consider, like liberalists, do not consider alliances to be permanent. They understand that alliances need to be based on our interests. But the difference between previous administrations and this administration, in my opinion, is that that previous administrations, like the George W. Bush administration, understood that alliances are necessary for us to achieve our objectives. And I do not see this in the rhetoric of the incoming Trump administration. Am I going too far?
Let me just, it raised a couple of questions. Let me interrupt you for a minute. For the first time in 3 attempts, President Trump has secured at least a plurality, maybe a majority, of the popular votes. Foreign policy was not, I guess, a huge issue in this campaign, except in select places like Michigan, where Middle East policy influenced some votes. What you're describing as the basic approach here, in my mind, differs not so much from the foreign policy approach of Teddy Roosevelt, who's gone down as a near great, or even great, he's up on Rushmore, American president. So what is it, do you think, in our political culture that makes this approach resonate?
I think what makes it resonate is the notion that we have the power to survive through isolationism, to drive international policy just based purely on the power that we have, economic power and military power. What, however, is lacking in the understanding is soft power. The United States has been able truly soft power. The United States has been able to, again, going back to my students will remind me many times that they, and along with many of their peers, are tired of being the police of the world, of financing conflicts around the world, of serving other countries' interests. What they do not understand is, of course, the fact that our investment, our involvement, our presence around the world isn't a zero-sum game. It is because of our presence around the world that we are more secure, that we are prosperous, and that we are more free. So what is different is the assumption that we can go alone.
Okay.
I would argue that this is a great mistake to assume that we can.
So assuming we're going to have a fairly transactional, America first, and if David Frum is correct, even somewhat predatory approach. What does this mean for Europe, do you think, in the near term? And I guess the top issues are Ukraine and the future of the NATO alliance.
Yes. Well, what it means for Europe is that there will be more pressure on Europe to act more quickly in providing the funds for not just NATO, but also for supporting Ukraine, but also to develop a convincing, stable, collective security policy in Europe. And so far they have failed, because certainly there is a level of nostalgia about Europe's alliance with the United States. Now, I want to be clear about it. Trump has made it very clear that if Europe doesn't live up to our expectations, the United States may pull back from NATO. I don't anticipate that the United States will truly leave NATO there. I don't see a chance in that regard. But the Trump administration, even the first time around, was not the first administration to make it very clear that the future of American foreign policy is not Europe. Even Obama, who was so loved, especially by my countrymen, Germans, maybe more so than by Americans, it came as a wake-up call when President Obama made it very clear that the future of American policy was not in Europe. Had it not been for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I doubt very much that the Biden administration would have focused as much on Europe. So Europeans are nostalgic about the past and about their relationship with the United States. They will have to come up with the resources to, again, not only help Ukraine for the security of Europe, but to establish a long-term, stable European collective security policy. And so here's where I see the problem. The political will isn't there. The political will to establish a strong European security policy hasn't been there for a long time because Europeans did rely on the United States to provide the lion's share in that regard.
Do you think it's possible for President Trump to change that dynamic? I mean, it occurs to me that talking about Europe, on one side of the divide, you have Russia, country badly bogged down in the Ukrainian war, a country suffering from acute alcohol poisoning, a country that has a declining birth rate, okay? Not exactly what looks like a great world power. In Europe, you've got places like the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Finland, Sweden, even throw in the Italian army. Okay, what is it about Europe that prevents them from being able to overwhelm Russia, if necessary, militarily?
They would probably have the ability to overwhelm. They are very aware of the potential risk of doing so. I do believe that Europe will have to continue a policy of balancing the powers of Ukraine with Russia to wear Russia out. But here's where I see the problem. This is where I see Trump's impact on Europe. The phenomenon that we're seeing in the United States, a true admiration among the right for Russia's demagogue and for authoritarian leadership, is not unique to the United States. There are right-wing parties in every corner of Europe. These right-wing parties, with the exception, we'll probably see Le Pen's right-wing party in France emerge. Meloni's party in Italy is already in power. In Germany, there is a real potential that the AfD, our extreme right-wing political party, which has not been called unconstitutional yet, but we're heading that way, but they may very much put forward the next chancellor. There are numerous right-wing parties who share the love for Putin. Why is that the case? And so I think let's go back to the United States in that regard. Where does this love for Russia and for Putin and for an authoritarian regime come from? It's not just Trump who expresses true admiration for it. Tucker Carlson, for example, he has spent quite a bit of time in Russia reporting on what he considers to be some of the advantages of living in Russia. The cleanliness, the organization, the comparatively cheap cost of living. Where does it come from? And I think I have a strong feeling that this admiration for Putin and authoritarian regimes stems very much from what the right considers traditional values in regard to women's rights and in regard to the LGBTQ community. So what I see the real impact of Trump and Europe is not the pressure to establish a collective security policy in Europe. That has always been the case for a long time. What I see is a way to a normalization of ideologies that used to not be acceptable in Europe.
Okay, thank you. We've solved Europe. Let's move on to Asia. And speaking of alliances, I think the Biden administration has done a pretty good job of stitching together a network of overlapping relationships and alliances in East Asia that are designed to deter China and, if necessary, push back if we experience Chinese aggression. I wonder if you could sum up, for all of our sakes, what exists right now in terms of these relationships, and perhaps, do you expect a change? And perhaps you could start by telling us what is going on in Korea. You served there, so.
I spent 2 weeks in Korea doing a military exercise in the middle of COVID, and that was very, very interesting. But I was in the joint headquarters, so I got a real, very high-level view of how this alliance, how this military relationship works. So, not to be overly simplistic, but obviously the U.S. relationships, diplomatic and military relationships in Asia function under a completely different sort of structure than in Europe. There's no sort of big alliance like NATO. The U.S. has really focused on strengthening a series of very important bilateral relationships that have been in place for a very long time. And then what has been sort of a new development over the past, didn't start with Biden actually. It started a little bit more under the previous Trump administration, bringing some of those very strong bilateral relationships and alliances together into not a formal alliance structure, but sort of informally working together and coordinating. So the key alliances are U.S.-Korea, which has been in place for a very long time, obviously. U.S.-Japan, another very long-standing military relationship where thousands of U.S. troops have been stationed in both of these countries for decades, and very, very well-established structures and coordinating mechanisms. Australia, probably, even though the population of Australia is relatively small, probably our closest military relationship in some ways. Australia has been with us in every conflict the United States has ever been in. And then to a much lesser extent, but sort of rising in importance is India. But really the U.S.-Korea, U.S.-Japan, U.S.-Australia relationships have been the linchpins of the U.S. presence and engagement in East Asia over the past several years. Now you may have heard of something called the Quad, and this refers to South Korea, Japan, Australia, the United States, working together to try to manage the rising tensions in East Asia. And a lot of those rising tensions come from the increasingly aggressive behavior of China, which is, in some ways, you can't blame the Chinese for trying to have some more breathing room, right? It's a growing economy, the second largest economy in the world, and they're tired of living in a system that was sort of created by the United States. So, and they're taking very strong action to create more space for themselves. But those alliance structures, especially the U.S., South Korea, U.S., Japan, like I said, they've been in place for decades and decades. So there's nothing really new about how we're interacting with those parties in particular. What's new is bringing them into a discussion, including Australia as well, and thinking about the U.S. relationship with these key allies as how we're going to manage tensions in East Asia. It's very complicated because each one of these countries, even though they're very strong military allies of the United States, are also very strong economic partners with China, as is the United States. So you can't separate these things. But that's sort of the structure under which the United States has been engaged.
And given that the building of this structure actually began in the Trump administration, you wouldn't expect revolutionary changes in approach to managing it.
I don't think so. So I brought I found it really interesting to note that I'm just going to read two different statements. One is from the previous Trump administration and one is from the Biden administration. See if you can tell the difference about how they're viewing the challenges posed by China. Okay, here's statement one. China is a revisionist power that wants to shape a world antithetical to U.S. values and interests. China seeks to displace the United States and the Indo-Pacific region, expand the reaches of its state-driven economic model, and reorder the region in its favor. That's challenge number one. Here's the other statement. China harbors the intention and increasing the capacity to reshape the international order in favor of one that tilts the global playing field to its benefit. The most pressing strategic challenge facing our vision is from powers that layer authoritarian governments with a revisionist foreign policy. Beijing has ambitions to create an enhanced sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific and to become the world's leading power. So it's really striking that they use the same. Statement number one, by the way, is straight out of the Trump administration's national security strategy 2017. Statement number two is out of the Biden administration's national security strategy from 2022. So these two administrations see the challenge posed by China very similarly. So it's not in the understanding of the challenge where they differ. It's in how they plan to approach it.
President Biden, in a way, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he overturned decades of strategic ambiguity on the question of whether or not we would defend Taiwan. Okay?
Right, yes.
He was pretty direct in saying, yes, we will do it. You expect President Trump to try to restore strategic ambiguity, or will he be equally explicit?
I think he's going to be similarly explicit, but on a different track. So, and there's evidence that Taiwan has already got the message. So we've talked a lot about, and everyone's heard about Trump's approach to a lot of things, not just foreign policy, is very transactional. And so we're all aware he thinks the members of NATO aren't paying their dues. Well, same kind of approach towards Taiwan. He's been very explicit that he thinks Taiwan needs to pay the United States to protect them. Well, guess what? 2 weeks ago, the government of Taiwan announced that in the year 2025, guess who's being inaugurated in 2025? They're going to spend $2.2 billion on arms purchases from the United States. So this is their signal to the Trump administration. We are ready to pay. Right? Now, $2.2 billion of arms purchases doesn't directly translate into $2.2 billion more of capacity, because this is, first of all, they're having recruiting problems in their military. So it's not, they don't have, they have a very capable military, but buying $2.2 billion of weapons isn't going to suddenly make them able to withstand the quickly modernizing force and expanding force of the Chinese People's Liberation Army.
Before I let you off the hook,
yeah,
what's going on in Korea?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people were shocked, including very high-level Korean insiders, by what happened in Korea. Not only that this sort of aborted coup happened, but also how quickly it was sort of reversed or put a stop to. So I think we're in a period now where, at least in the United States, there's a lot of just concern about what does this say about the stability of Korea, this really key ally? Let's remember, we still have 35,000 American troops permanently stationed there. The command structures, I mean, I've served in NATO, and I did this military exercise in Korea, and this is where I have to reiterate. I'm sharing my own opinion. I'm not representing the official opinion of the United States Army or the Department of Defense, but the difference that I experienced working inside NATO versus inside the U.S.-Korea alliance, it was astonishing. The level of cohesion that I saw within this joint command structure in Korea, I found it was really inspiring to me. And there's a real sense of joint purpose that is more dispersed in NATO. I mean, when you have an alliance that has so many members, it's hard to have that same really explicit sense of shared mission, but that exists in Korea. And so I don't expect the military relationship to suddenly crumble, not at all, because the threat that causes that alliance to continue to exist, which is the extraordinary power of the North Korean military that's got its artillery trained on Seoul at all times, hasn't changed at all. So that military alliance is going to continue to work together, but the political leadership that overlays it needs to continue to resource it. And so that's the question. Is this a weird momentary blip, or is there some deeper instability? And I don't think anyone really knows. It is such a shock that I think there's going to be a lot of...
President Yoon, the guy who declared martial law,
Yeah.
is toast now, right?
Right, but...
I mean, he's basically finished.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what further... I think we'll have to wait a little while to see what else comes out about what led to this and who else is with President Yoon.
Okay, good. I've got a question for both of you, and it's basically a people question. There are senior officials from the first Trump administration, some of which have written books, some of whom have written books about their experiences, who said that the president often made snap judgments based on his own instincts, in which he had a great deal of faith. Sometimes they were able to walk the president back. Sometimes they were not able to do so. I was struck by a recent article in the New York Times about a 1983 war game in the Pentagon, actually in National Defense University, about the use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield and whether or not this can be managed. I want to read you a bit of a part of a quote before I pose the question. History shows that deterrence often fails and that countries can maneuver themselves into corners where they have no choice but to enter into wars they cannot win, wars of assured self-destruction. Now we are entering an era where nuclear arms control is an open question. Non-proliferation has failed. Conventional conflicts are spreading. Overwrought nationalism is on the rise. The use of small nuclear weapons again seems possible. Deterrence is weakening, and fools dream of managing nuclear escalation in the midst of battle. Nuclear war in some form seems to be coming to the neighborhood. There is little sign that changes are being pursued to lower the risk. There is no reason to panic, but Katie, bar the door, unquote. So here's the question. Assuming the people President Trump has nominated for key national security positions get confirmed by the Senate, will they be able to influence and shape wise and successful presidential decisions? Or are there literally no more guardrails? What do you think?
All right, I'll go first. So you might be surprised to learn that in the first Trump administration, they actually had some very serious people on China in the administration. And they were sort of one level below the cabinet people whose names you would be familiar with. So Matt Pottinger was on the National Security Council, and fluent Mandarin speaker, really knows a lot about China, and was really shaping the Trump administration's approach to China. And they have someone similar to that who is going to take a key role in this administration. His name is Alex Wong, and he's been nominated to be the Deputy National Security Advisor. So the National Security Advisor will sort of, not be a specialist in a certain area of the world, but this deputy, Alex Wong, who served in the previous Trump administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia, is going to be at that next higher level in the White House, really shaping the Trump administration's policy towards China. Now, he's, from what I understand, he's a bit of a hawk, which is not a surprise, but what'll be really interesting is how the Trump administration develops its approach towards working with the alliance structure that we have in East Asia, because Alex Wong has, in the previous Trump administration, backed these sort of multilateral approaches, working with the Quad, working with these strong bilateral alliances. But some of the other people who have been nominated for cabinet positions have generally are more interested or have talked about more unilateral approaches. So we don't know yet which approach is going to sort of win out, or how public that discussion will be, but that'll be something to look for, is how this argument takes place within the Trump administration, the degree to which we work with this alliance structure that the Trump administration helped develop during its previous time in the White House, or whether they're going to, whether they see the rise of China as like more of a problem than it was last time around, and they need to take even stronger unilateral approaches because, for example, maybe they think we can't rely on South Korea anymore because of this strange thing that happened. So we gotta do it more on our own. But I don't know what that would look like concretely. I mean, the United States doesn't have enough forward presence on its own. I mean, our forward presence in East Asia is in Korea, it's in Japan. So you can't send every single aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy to just sit permanently in the West Pacific. So even the top Trump administration nominated officials who seem to be more in favor of a unilateral approach don't have that many options for pure unilateralism in Asia in terms of sort of managing Chinese influence.
Great. Karin, what do you think? I mean, Marco Rubio, Michael Waltz, these are pretty serious people, right? What do we have to worry about?
I'm glad that Malia started, because it reminded me once again that this administration understands that there is a real risk with not dealing with China in the region, whereas the approach to Europe, again, I think is a very different one, of course, starting with Trump's promise to end the Ukraine war overnight. Now, this is a promise that he can actually realistically pursue, and that we need to be clear about it. Will the United States benefit from it? I would argue certainly not. It's a very real risk in making any kinds of deals with Putin, who has violated international laws, and a deal that is brokered by the United States can only undermine the credibility of the United States abroad. So that's my starting point. Now, are these people going to help provide good, wise guidance. Marco Rubio is the odd one out of the list. In that he is probably more experienced, and it's not surprising that, given his position and the relative independence, the power that he will have, that Trump would choose someone who is not just chosen for the loyalty toward him. Everyone else that you listed was chosen for their loyalty toward Trump. Now, I want to emphasize, this is nothing unusual. Cabinet positions are usually not filled by people for their expertise. They are chosen to help presidents pursue the policy platform they promise their voters. And that is certainly the case with this administration too. The difference, of course, and that is why some of these nominees seem odd, is because they are chosen precisely to weaken the institutions they are asked to lead in many cases. Now, Europe is a very different case scenario to the Asian region, because again the focus will not be on Europe anymore. The people who Trump has nominated certainly are in line with his dislike for the U.S. role within NATO and dislike for the lack of contributions from our allies in NATO. Hexas is known to be wary of the organization. In a nutshell, they're well chosen for what Trump has promised to do in the region.
Terrific. Before turning it over to you, I'll just say a couple of very, very, very brief things about the Middle East. Conventional wisdom says that Donald Trump is going to do anything Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, wants him to do. That may be correct, but I'm not sure. One thing Donald Trump has noticed from the current administration is that since October 7th, 2023, when those horrific attacks took place in Israel, starting on that day, the President of the United States has been a passenger in a runaway car driven by the Prime Minister of Israel. Donald Trump, I guarantee, is not going to be a passenger in somebody else's car. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu understands this very clearly. And it wouldn't surprise me at all to see a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip taking effect on or about January 20th, 2025. The other thing to keep in mind in this is that Bibi Netanyahu is not Donald Trump's closest Middle Eastern associate. Far from it. There is still bad blood between them because Netanyahu called President Biden soon after the 2020 election to congratulate him on his victory. Donald Trump thought that was totally inappropriate, of course, that the election had been stolen. Okay, that bad blood still exists, but the closest relationship President Trump has in the Middle East is with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. Okay, MBS wants a mutual defense treaty with the United States, not an executive agreement, a treaty, something subject to 2/3 approval in the United States Senate. He knows he can't get to 2/3 unless he normalizes relations with Israel. He knows he can't normalize relations with Israel as long as the bombings in Gaza continue. Sorry, and as long as there is no pathway to a Palestinian state. So, this is going to be a little bit more challenging for President Trump than simply checking the box and telling Prime Minister Netanyahu, do what you wish. Second, and finally, on Iran, conventional wisdom is that President Trump will revert to the policy of maximum pressure on Iran. I suspect he will. But I suspect even with Iran, there is a possibility of a major agreement, one that would cover not only nuclear, but it would get Iran out of the business of subverting and ruining countries in the Middle East. This was the shortcoming of the agreement President Obama reached with Iran. There were limits on the nuclear side of things, but with the lifting of sanctions, the Iranians had an avalanche of cash to make trouble everywhere else in the Middle East. The Biden administration realized that that was the case and was holding out for a much broader agreement with the Iranians. President Trump may be able to pull it off. We'll see. Okay, over to you.
Yes, I have a question that tie together several strands you brought out in your talk. The first one was about nuclear war and how fools think that they could manage a conflict. Ken Follett recently published a novel that was a kind of thought experiment about how could we go into a nuclear war, and his premise was it would be like the First World War, that nobody really wanted, but everybody kind of slid into it, as you quoted in your piece. And in his thought experiment, the trigger was the North Koreans poking the South Koreans because they figured the Chinese had their back. I'm wondering if another plausible scenario is the Israelis poking the Iranians because they figure the U.S. has their back.
Yeah.
In the case of Iran, it's true that the Iranians are probably only a few weeks away from having enough enriched uranium that could be used to make a nuclear weapon. It would probably take the Iranians another year to develop nuclear warheads and fit them on missiles. Okay, so that there is still some time for this to be addressed. Between 2013 and 2015, I was engaged in I was out of government, but I was asked to conduct some secret talks involving Iranians who were designated by the Iranian government about what it would take to reach a nuclear deal. I got to know these Iranians pretty well, and after a while the discussions were very frank. And in one of the discussions, my Iranian counterpart said, "Fred, the truth is, we don't want to develop nuclear weapons." And I said, what are you talking about here? I said, is it because the supreme leader says it's un-Islamic? He says, no. He said, it has nothing to do with that. He said, if we go nuclear, what happens in the region? The Saudis go nuclear. The Turks go nuclear. The Egyptians go nuclear. The Emiratis go nuclear. He said, we Iranians are doing a pretty good job establishing our influence all over this region without nuclear weapons. If we go nuclear and everybody else goes nuclear, every time we make a move, whether it's in Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen. It's like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay? Think about it. It makes some sense. But I asked him, I said, okay, well then what are the negotiations about? He said, well, we're using it as leverage. We need to get out from under sanctions. So I think that's what's going on here. Yes, sir.
This is along the same line. I was thinking about your reference to Teddy Roosevelt and the kind of imperialistic foreign policy we had at the turn of the century. And then juxtaposed with the fact that I was raised in a small farming country in the Appalachians. And one of the aspects of that society is an absolute visceral fascination with firepower. Those are hunting rifles and shotguns. But there's a vital thing about humans that seem to be fascinated. So the difference between Teddy Roosevelt and now is what you just mentioned. I mean, there are no small nuclear devices.
No.
Yeah, you can't throttle them down far enough to make them a small device.
Yeah, I don't think there's a tactical device that's smaller than what vaporized Hiroshima.
Right, yeah. So my question is, what do you do with that?
Well, that's what this exercise in 1983 tried to address, and it involved mutual exchanges of tactical nukes between the Warsaw Pact and NATO centered on Germany, sorry to say. And it was just, it proved to be not controllable. And this wasn't just a bunch of academics sitting around. Secretary of Defense Weinberger was a player in the background. And the conclusion they reached was that it's not manageable. Once the genie is out of the bottle, you don't necessarily go to thermonuclear war with, Washington, D.C. and Moscow being eliminated. But on the battlefield, very, very, very hard to stop. And in this exercise, Hamburg was obliterated.
My question is, what do you do with the human fascination with firepower and with those weapons?
I'll leave that to one of my colleagues. I don't know.
Yeah. What about this call from the Russian general to our military command recently?
My understanding is that there was a conversation, between was it the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or the Secretary of Defense?
Charles Brown.
Okay, so his chairman of the Joint Chiefs and his Russian counterpart. The Russians are about to conduct a naval exercise in the Mediterranean. And given all the tensions in Syria and everything else, they didn't want there to be any misunderstandings. So it was a good thing. It's kind of the way a hotline should be used.
Is that a little light under the shade? Or some, they're saying a roundabout way, all this nuclear threats, shaking bombs and everything.
Yeah, no, this didn't involve any nuclear threats. I understand.
I mean, the contact.
Pardon me?
Direct contact. I mean, that's not common.
It's increasingly uncommon between the United States and Russia. It used to be fairly routine.
I've seen estimates that the Russians are losing about 1,500 people a day in the Ukraine, and now Syria, which has been under Russian protection, is about to possibly collapse. Where does that leave the Russian military? I mean, we're all acting like we're afraid of it. They seem to have serious problems at this point.
Yeah, they do. You talk about the Ukrainian situation. the Russians are still advancing, right?
Yes, they're still advancing, and I'm sure are emboldened by the current situation. You two have the military background, so you would be probably better equipped to evaluate the military strategies and the advancements even in that region. Of course, you're aware of the support Russia has, for example, received from North Korea. But in addition to that, Russia has not by any means been isolated in the world. And has managed to build alliances that may not necessarily strengthen them militarily, but certainly as a global power, I would say.
Christine, yep.
Moving away from the military dimension of international relations under Trump, what do you envision the impact of these tariffs to be? Is it minor? Is it major? Is it blowing smoke? What are these tariffs all about?
All right, well, I'm glad you brought that up.
You're the economist, right?
No, I'm not an economist, but I have to pay attention to these because this is sort of the defining feature of U.S.-China relations right now. So as you may all recall, the first Trump administration ended with a trade war with China. That the Trump administration put into place a bunch of different tariffs and trade barriers, and then the Biden administration basically continued those. So there really hasn't been a huge difference in approach between the first Trump administration and the Biden administration in terms of seeing China as a major problem for American competitiveness and American technological innovation and advances and our ability to rely on ourselves militarily. And there's every sign that this economic tension is going to increase. So on Monday this week, the Biden administration announced, what did they announce? They announced wider trade bans specifically targeting China's chip industry. And I think we pay attention to that, particularly here in the Hudson Valley because of the IBM legacy. And the Biden administration has really tried to, there's a protectionist element of this, trying to help American chip manufacturers regain some of their strength. So the Chinese retaliated on Tuesday of this week by, they immediately banned the sales of a whole bunch of different rare minerals and rare earths that are critical to a bunch of different technologies that we really rely on. So this is just a signal that we're going to see these economic tensions not just continue, but probably ratchet up. How it's going to affect us, I'm not. There's potentially very widespread sort of trickle-down effects. I don't understand enough about how these rare earths are used, and are there alternatives that can be developed quickly, or do we have stockpiles? There are a lot of questions about that, but the signals are there that both the United States and China are willing to undertake or to take on economic sacrifice in order to deny the other some kind of advantage. And so to what extent are we hurting ourselves? Since I'm not an economist, I don't really understand. The CHIPS Act was meant to help American manufacturers expand their capabilities. None of these things are fast-moving policies. And I don't know to what extent the Trump administration would continue that kind of domestic investment. Certainly he, in the first Trump administration, he sort of came out swinging and wanting to, have this sort of tough persona against China and put these tariffs in place in the first place. So I think he's going to be willing to, continue this sort of tit for tat. But how it is going to affect each one of us personally.
So Karen, how about Europe? We're going to see a trade war?
Not sure about Europe, but Canada and Mexico. I was just going to add, right, it's like we're focusing China, of course, there is the threat of this extraordinary, up to 70%, I believe, tariffs that nobody, I think, assumes that this is really going to happen. These are used, the tariffs are used as threats, as a bargaining tool, but certainly tariffs will be imposed, but not to that level. Seeing tariffs imposed, or the threat of tariffs imposed as a bargaining tool with Mexico, for example, to get immigration and check, is just, once again, it's an illustration of what I was trying to say earlier, the predatory foreign policy with no real reflection, at least not openly, about the consequences that it will have on the United States. Of course, tariffs have consequences. We don't have to be economists to know that tariffs always backfire. It will always lead to trade wars, and trade wars are not good for our economic prosperity. Again, we don't have to be economists to understand that our tariffs will lead to tariffs on the other side. And when we are exposed to tariffs, then that will affect our domestic production. If I may, actually, we don't have much time, but if I may take the discussion on tariffs and take it to the sub-Saharan African continent, one that I'm actually not a Europeanist. I said to Fred, like, don't expect too much of me. I'm European, but I'm not a Europeanist. But I've spent a lot of time in African countries, and where my research was based, and even when I spent most time there, about 20 years ago, I hate to say that, but it's Chinese investment was very evident. And I'm sure most of you are aware of the fact that Chinese foreign direct investment in Africa is widespread, and there's a reason why they're there. And it's evident now in the way we're falling behind, for example, on research and development on electric car batteries. Just to give you one example, we're falling behind because we don't have the relationships with countries that we need to have a relationship with in order to have the resources necessary for us to move forward and not lose in the race on areas such as, for example, the development of electric car batteries. I lost my train of thought, but I think that's. I wanted to throw that out there. It goes beyond tariffs, the discussion of the predatory foreign policy that I see the Trump administration moving forward is not going to help us establish the kinds of relationships to ensure that we will continue being a leader in the world, not just in terms of security, but also economically and socially.
Yeah, I think there's probably a pretty good chance that this is a bargaining tool, especially I would think concerning Canada and Mexico, because supply chains are I mean, just put a microscope on the automobile industry and those supply chains, and how do you do a tariff on Mexico or Canada? Having to do with auto parts or something, without crippling yourself, your own ability to manufacture. Peter.
A couple of things. First, for the Israelis, it's existential about Iran and the nuclear. For Trump and for the right, many of his supporters, it's simplistically they are the devils, the foreign devils, the Iranians. Isn't there every reason to believe that with Iran's anti-aircraft defenses gone, with them vulnerable, that the Trump administration would support an Israeli taking out of the Iranian nuclear facilities, which is a scary start. The other thing, and it's a quickie for you about Syria, is if tomorrow we find out that Assad is now in exile in London practicing medicine again, and the present opposition is ruling Syria, Who does that help?
On on Iran, yes, I think President Trump is going to employ maximum pressure. I'm not necessarily opposed to that, including the traditional warning, and this is something we really didn't discuss. Most real foreign policy experts say that there is a lot more to the idea of continuity in foreign policy between Democrats and Republicans than we often acknowledge. Okay? President Biden has made it very clear that Iran, under no circumstances, is going to be permitted to develop a nuclear weapon. That's not Donald Trump. That's Joe Biden. And the implication of that is that we will use military means, perhaps in conjunction with Israel. Just giving Israel a green light to do it isn't sufficient, because even though the air defenses are gone, the Israelis don't have the loitering capability over targets dug deeply into the earth that the United States has. Any air campaign designed to destroy Iranian nuclear facilities requires the United States. Okay. On Syria, it's anybody's guess what's going to happen next. I think the key variable is the state of the Syrian army, the official Syrian army. Sure, the Russians and the Iranians want to save Bashar al-Assad, and they'll do their best with limited resources at their disposal. The Russians are bogged down in Ukraine. The Iranians have just taken a real kick to the gut, right? They'll still do their best. But if this Syrian army is just hollowed out by years of inactivity, corruption, criminality, producing amphetamines, if that's what's left of the Syrian army, then the door to Damascus is wide open to this other group, a group that says it disassociated itself from Al-Qaeda in 2016. Okay, who knows? I think the requirement for the United States right now is to consult very, very closely, coordinate very, very closely with Turkey. Because it was the Turkish green light that launched this operation. The Turks just got tired of Bashar al-Assad not willing to agree to a formula for the safe and protected return of Syrian refugees. There are millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey, and for President Erdogan, it's an important domestic political priority to get them back into Syria. Assad was not playing ball, so Erdogan said, okay, you want it bad, you're going to get it bad. All right, but Turkish influence on this group that's advancing is all important. To me, there's nothing more important than getting rid of Bashar al-Assad. He is the premier war criminal of the 21st century. Putin has given him a run for the money, but so far it's Assad. But the people kind of walking through his army right now are not necessarily nice guys. And if you're a Syrian Christian, if you're a Syrian Alawite, if you're a Syrian Shia, you're scared right now with these guys on the march. So the Turks have a very, very, very important mission. in telling these characters what the limits are. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you immediately raised the question of the Syrian-Israeli work that you did so assiduously under the Obama administration. I read a summary on the U.S. Peace Institute about your work, and it said something about the 67 borders were an agreed target. There were some fine points to work out in terms of yards of ground that were critical. But in the light of that experience, what is the possibility of a Palestinian state agreement, do you think, coming from with certain recognized borders in terms that might have been acceptable in 2010 or whenever that was, and where we are right now, and with the Saudis' interest that you raised earlier? How do you see the potential for a final disposition that would finally allow a two-state solution? I just think it's
a long way off. It's a long way off. What the events of October 7th, 2023, and the subsequent war have demonstrated is the remarkable degree to which Israelis and Palestinians have thoroughly dehumanized one another. Okay? In Israel, support for a two-state solution used to be at the 60-70% level. Not that long ago. Now, I don't know, 15-20%. So many Israelis are convinced that Palestinians are simply okay with what happened on October 7th, 2023. And Palestinians, of course, live not only with the bombing campaign in the Gaza Strip, but before that, years and years and years of occupation and all of the daily insults that involved. So somehow breaking this chain of mutual dehumanization, where each side considers itself to be the completely righteous victim of the other side. That chain has to be broken. And I got to tell you, this will require skills that go way beyond diplomacy. Way beyond diplomacy. Peter, I think we've reached our time limit.
I'm sure there are rooms at the inns nearby, and we can all just come back for breakfast.
This has been spectacular.
Thank you. Thank you all for your attention and your marvelous questions. Really appreciate it.